We're talking the beginning of time. According to the story that I heard, that there were lots of wonderful things that happened, and there were catastrophes that happened. And there was a time in which we'll say that it was like a period of fire, where the sun and the light and everything got really hot. It felt like the water disappeared.
My name is Zoe Norcross-Nau, and I am the Watershed Protection Coordinator for the Comox Valley Regional District. In 2012, the Comox Valley Regional District was mandated by Island Health to create a watershed protection plan because it's the drinking water source for over 45,000 people, 50,000 people in the Comox Valley. Snow is incredibly important for our drinking water supply. In fact, about 50% of the water that comes into Comox Lake comes via the Cruikshank River. And 1/3 of the water in the Cruikshank River comes specifically from melting snow. It's like storage when water is stored as snow, and it can then melt as the months get warmer and supply continuous steady stream of inflow to Comox Lake into the watershed. With climate change, we're seeing snowpacks are being reduced, and the season in which snow accumulates is getting shorter. There's definitely no question about the fact that the Comox Glacier is receding, and along with that, we're also seeing decreases in the snowpack that's so important to the water supply of Comox Lake and the Comox Valley water system.
The Comox Valley is an interesting place. Eastern Vancouver Island is an interesting place. I mean, every place on the planet has its colonial and settler story that gets layered down upon thousands and thousands and thousands of years of Indigenous place and Indigenous experience. The settler history here really fragmented the landscape on so many levels. A guy named Dunsmuir secured a land grant, part of the Settlement Act of 1885, which essentially privatized a quarter of Vancouver Island, from the Vancouver Island mountain range right down to the Salish Sea. And everything about life on Eastern Vancouver Island is informed by that settlement grant, is informed by that private, deeply private land ownership. We have water and land and timber titles fractured apart from each other and owned and held by different people. We're sitting on unceded territory where there were no treaties ever with Indigenous people. And it's really interesting to be here now when people are so deeply in love with the idea of place and protecting the forest and protecting the trees. And all of that comes on top of a landscape that has been heavily impacted by humanity, and I'm not sure that we've totally reconciled those impacts yet.
In the beginning of time, when the world was changing, the myth people decided to become human, so they took their costumes off. And and the Thunderbird who came down, we called Hikwatin. And Hikwatin took his costume off and he sent it back. He's now a human. Poyaman came from the sun, and now he was human. And those two, became the founders, of the Potlatch people.
So my name is Arzina Hamir. My husband and I own Amara Farm here in the Comox Valley on unceded Comox territory. There's something that drew me to the energy of the valley. We obviously farm here and so are really connected to soil and to land. If I don't leave my farm for a week, I'm not unhappy. It really feeds my soul, and my soil. So one of the things that we really do have to address is that I am farming stolen land. This would have been land that the First Nation here that would have probably had a Gary Oak and Camas meadow. Like this whole area of the valley was a upper prairie and was being actively managed for food. First Nations were pushed off of their land. The land was then sold privately, and now I'm in ownership of this land. And until we can figure out, a better way of reconciling that history, for now I look at myself as the steward of this land, and I try and manage it in a way that I think would hopefully meet the expectations of the ancestors who would have been here, and that is to try and leave it in a better way than I found it. We also irrigate both through water that we've collected off of the farm, but our wash water is all using well water, so we are incredibly dependent on having a snowpack, having glacier water that eventually feeds all the systems that finally make it to our property. The Comox Valley, I think a large part of our identity is that glacier. Water and watershed protection and water issues are such a big conversation. The farming community, relies, it's intrinsic in the way that we work, and maybe not everybody understands the intricacies and the dependency and the threats to our waters. I think we need to talk about it. It seems like a really taboo subject right now, I think, because it is so painful. But I think we need to start having those conversations, because like I said, we can prepare technically, but what will we do spiritually? I think the lack of conversation is partly due because of the multiple jurisdictions that are involved in managing water and watersheds. So all of that's managed provincially. The impacts are felt locally, and that's where it's just like you bang your head thinking like, oh, why can't we just work together? But when you've got multiple levels of government and multiple ministries, it's like pulling teeth.
My name is Wedlady Speck, and I'm also known as Katemu of the Cape Moot clan of Comox Valley, and also when I'm the head chief of the Geeksum clan of the Kwagil. The valley is made up of 3 tribal groups. There's the Puntledge, Aigson, and Comox, and I'm from the Aigson of those 3. And so I'm one of 5 hereditary chiefs that make up the Aigson tribe. Historically, the territory is the territory of the Puntledge tribe. They have lived here since time immemorial. There was a dream by a Puntledge elder who could see that there was going to be difficulties and challenges ahead, right? And so they began to prepare for that. But the first challenge was actually the disappearing of the water. That was followed by this dream that saw that the water would return, but it would cover all the land. And so the people believed him. He was a wise man and a really trustful man. And so they began to prepare their foods and prepare their canoes and prepare with the ropes that they needed. And so I understood that they tied their canoe to a rope, a big rock rather, at the mouth of the estuary. And when the waters did come, they were in the canoes, and that rock was the steadfast place for them that held them in place, right? And so the water did cover the land. While they were in their canoes and waiting out the flood, a whale, a white whale came and became a symbol of hope for them and faith, and they really trusted that. And it stayed with them as that symbol until such time as the floodwaters began to go down. And as the water began to go down, the white whale ended up on top of a mountain, and that's where it landed. That was followed, say, by another significant event where it got really cold, and so the ice came and the glacier covered the mountain where the whale was, and so to the Puntledge people that the ice and the whale, ice became the whale, and that it became that same symbol of hope. So as we look at the glacier disappearing, We're going through another time in which we need to step up and look at ourselves and look at our relationship with the world. And I think are we going to be leaders in changing our relationship, or are we going to be blinded by the greed and disharmony of the world right now?
I think the glacier fits into the conversation about the watershed as this really, really important symbol. Not only is it integral to the storytelling of the community we live in, the flood story here, to the development, like the exploration of the watershed, to art, it's obvious that we're watching a glacier in decline. And so what we see there is the story continuing to unfold.
Gaeligasla, Nugwa Gamutalaglis, Gagnachamuskamadzaudeno. My name is David Dawson. One of my traditional names is Gamutalaglis. I come from the Muskamadzaudeno of Kinkham Inlet, born and raised in the beautiful territories here. I'm an Indigenous support worker here. I believe it's about being here for our youngsters. One of the things that we talk about lots is Indigenous ways of being and living. That's something that's saved my life. Bringing it back to cultural ways of practicing love and kindness, respect and generosity, that I put those, my actions and my thoughts through those 4 values. It's really hard to go wrong, just like climate, We need to start thinking more indigenously. Sometimes I say things like that, When we go into a place, we're supposed to leave it in a better condition than when we leave. Little things like that go a long ways. These little seeds being planted all the time. I walk life based off a lot of my own recovery. I'm in recovery, so resiliency. Talking about resiliency, I think is huge. Especially here. I have this beaded timeline that stretches back 14,000+ years, and to be proud of, because we've been through so much. I was like, look, our people have been down on this coast here for that long, and we've been through so many change within that time frame. This is just going to be another part of it. We've got to live in the now, and just like those values I speak of, love, kindness, respect, and generosity. If we practice those on a day-to-day basis, I think you'd be doing the whole world a favor.
My name is Amber Davis. I'm 23 years old, and I'm trying to learn Michif. So if you'll bear with me, I have my little dictionary on my phone. Tanishi Amber Dishinikashun. I am a student at the University of Victoria. I'm an Indigenous major with a minor in visual arts. I myself am in so much student debt right now, and when I told my mom that I was getting student loans, she almost cried, was so stressed out for me and my future. And it took me a moment to think that I don't think about my future the same way that she does, and the same way that she thought about her future when she was my age. How can we focus on climate change? How can that even be a thought in our minds when we can't afford to live, we can't afford to buy groceries? I think that's deliberate. When we're talking about issues of climate change, we're talking about Indigenous issues. Those two are so intrinsically linked together that you can't talk about one without the other. I think we have so much to learn from the elders that live here in this land. It needs to go all the way to the top. It needs to be on the forefront of our government's mind, of our city council's mind, not only on the individual's mind. There's this wide system of knowledge that is so so grand and so vast. We need to do this now. That is our way forward. That is our way forward. It's our only way forward. We need to be doing this now.
And what they said, what I understand the way it was said, is that when the water began to recede, the whale landed on top of the mountain, and they rebuilt, and they lived in the land in which they had felt the most safe, right? And so, you know, so the important part of that for me, the story of Quanish, is that you know, it's connected, we'll say, to how the Puntlich people valued the place in which they originated and which they owned, right? And it was like coming home.